Hi, welcome. My name is Charlotte. I love colorful and sparkly makeup, and I try to be critical and open about the intersection between the makeup industry and capitalism, and just sort of how I'm trying to navigate that as somebody who both loves makeup and loves the makeup space, and also identifies as an anti-capitalist. So that's what I try to do here on my channel. That's what we're going to be talking about today, in part. And if that sounds like interesting content to you, then I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and like this video and come back for the next one. So the main focus of today's video is going to be like an update on my last no-buy, my sort of approach to this stuff for the next few months. I also wanted to do a quick update for you on my reading life, because back in January when I talked about the no-buy that I was starting back then, I also mentioned that it was a goal for me to read more physical books and just read more in general. And at least one commenter, I think only one commenter, but one of you mentioned that you'd be interested in an update on that, on what I've been reading and how I'm doing with that goal. So I am going to do an update about that as well, and I'm going to put that at the end of the video in case you want to dip out at that point if you're only interested in the makeup portion of the video. And I do have notes on my phone that I will be looking at. I have the dual problem of looking down too much whenever I am looking at notes, and going off on tangents and rambling when I'm not looking at notes, so I'm gonna try to be disciplined about both of those things in this video. So I have been on a no-buy on and off for about going on a year and a half now. I've been doing periodic no-buys, and then in between I have a few months at a time where I'm not restricting myself at all. I'm not on a low buy, I'm not on a budget. And then I'll go back on a no-buy. I have struggled with overconsumption in the past. I've struggled with moderation, and I don't think that I have a healthy relationship mentally to buying things, especially buying makeup. And I've made a few videos about this now, so I'm not gonna recap all of that here, but I will link them below in case you're interested to sort of follow my journey thinking through these. I've done periodic updates, but each of those videos sort of has a slightly different focus, I think. But my main reasons for wanting to limit my consumption are, environmental and political reasons too, just because in terms of values and politics, I'm not always comfortable with the role that I play as a makeup consumer. I'm also motivated by the environmental impact of consumption and, the beauty industry. We know that this is a problem. And I've also talked in the past about the attention cost of makeup consumption. I'm somebody who spends a lot of time following beauty content, which brings me a lot of joy and isn't in and of itself something that I see as a problem, but sometimes that can translate into an unhealthy focus on buying things and wanting things that takes my mental energy away from other things. So again, check out those previous videos if you're interested to know more about that. And then of course there's also the financial piece to overconsumption, and I'm fortunate that that wasn't a huge concern at the outset for me. I was pretty financially secure, and also a lot of the makeup that I overconsumed tended to be drugstore and affordable makeup. But that has been an increasing concern because I did just move recently. Moving is really expensive, and also I'm in a higher cost of living area than I was before. And with inflation and lifestyle creep when it comes to wanting more and more expensive makeup, I am starting to feel pretty concerned about the financial thing. I have chosen to focus on no buys versus low buys because I have consistently in the past found it easier to stick to no buys than to a budget or limited transactions or a set number of items in each category. I really appreciate that a no buy comes with an automatic no. It just always felt when I was trying to do a no buy or a makeup budget, it would take a lot more mental energy. And it felt like it would take a lot of discipline, because for the no-buy, it's like there's this overarching discipline that it takes to finish out the no-buy, but it feels more like a decision that I've already made rather than a decision that I'm having to like remake every day or every week, to have to exercise that discipline to be like, nope, I'm still on a low buy. And also, whenever I was on a low buy, I would find myself like just spending too much time thinking about purchasing makeup, like spending too much time agonizing over each thing that I came across. It's like, was I gonna buy it? Like each new makeup release, was I gonna buy it? And I felt like this always would put me in a state of mind where resisting temptation just became more difficult than it had to be, because I was obsessing about purchasing itself, if that makes sense. So no buys were a way to sort of set myself up for success. And so just to give you a quick recap, I did a no buy in 2023 from February through August. So 6 months of the year. I was off of my no buy through September, so for like 2 months. And then I did a no buy October. And then I was back off the no buy for about another 2 months before I went on a 3-month no buy. So that was from the end of December through the end of March. And now I've been off of my no buy again since the end of March. So that's been 2.5 months. And I consistently find that in those in-between times, I do overconsume. And I'm not trying to like be prescriptive about how much is too much or what other people should be doing. I don't have a set metric for myself either for like how much is too much. All I can tell you is that the amount that I've consumed sort of between my no buys, in all of these cases, it's not where I want to be long term. And so I would always get to a place after, I guess usually it's about after 2 months, I would always get to a place where I felt like I was sort of forced back on a no buy, kind of like on an emergency basis, not to sound too dramatic, but I felt like it was getting out of control again. And again, like I was prepared for that. I accepted that as like the cost of doing business, because I, for myself, had made the decision that that was going to be easier for me to sort of like get where I wanted to be in the long term, that it was more important to me to stick to my no buys and like keep the promises I made to myself than it was for me to like hit some goal number for the year. And for me, it was worth it to have like, you know, the automatic no of the no buy and then the unrestrictedness of the non-no buy. It was like I never had to overthink it. I felt like that was the system I chose to keep myself out of the headspace of hyper focusing on makeup purchasing. Yeah, so I say that I overconsumed during those periods, but it's not a regret in that like I kind of knew I would, and I knew that that wasn't like a long-term solution for me. It was just sort of like developing moderation and developing discipline was more advanced, and it's something that I would do in the future. And I've started to notice a pattern in sort of how those periods of unrestricted purchasing go. And at the beginning, I'll start out by just buying things that were sort of at the top of my wish list, things I've been wanting for a really long time. And in a lot of cases, those turn out to be really good purchases, like things I really enjoy and get a lot of use out of. And I also think it's worth noting that in the past, my collection was a lot smaller and it was also a lot lower quality. So when I came off of my first no buy, I felt like I had sort of spent that time developing a better sense of what I wanted and what I was interested in and what my tastes were. And then each purchase that I made right after that no buy was adding a lot of like marginal value to my collection, if that makes sense. So this was sort of like the difference between having no contour products and having one contour product. Or it was the difference between having only ColourPop eyeshadows and then trying indie eyeshadows for the first time. So like each thing I was adding to my collection made a big difference, and it was like a lot better than the things that I had before. Now that my collection is larger and more comprehensive and made up of higher quality makeup and also reflects more my tastes and like what I know I like, at this point, each new thing that I buy is like, it's just not going to add as much value. Like that's just an inevitable fact. So even if I have something on my wish list for a long time and I like feel a lot of desire for it and it's super hyped, chances are that thing is not going to be that different from what I already have, and chances are it's not going to be that better than what I already have. So I have noticed, like, since I finished my most recent no buy, like each thing I buy, it feels less worth the purchase, if that makes sense, than the things that I was buying last year. I hope I'm explaining this well. And additionally, each time I go off a no-buy, I notice that over time, my purchases will become more impulsive. And I also sometimes notice in myself that there's like a kind of guilty pleasure and a feeling of indulgence that comes with buying something on a whim, just because I'm like allowed to now. And overall, like as I get farther and farther from the end of my no-buy, my purchasing tends to become more emotional and more like for the fix of buying something. And every time that I've come off a no-buy, this sort of like progression has happened, like a sort of like deterioration from feeling like, oh, I'm making smart decisions, I'm getting things that I truly wanted and that truly have a place in my collection, sort of deteriorating into some of these bad habits. And that deterioration is what tells me that it's time to go back on a no-buy. This time, I felt like that deterioration was happening sooner than in the past. And I think that this is telling me that I shouldn't be on unrestricted buying anymore. I'm moving on now. I think it's time for me to focus more on moderation and discipline and like building those muscles more for the long term. And I feel like I'm more prepared now than I would have been, than I was, because honestly, like when I first started that no-buy in February 2023, it wasn't my intention to do a no-buy in 2023. It was my intention to do a low buy and a beauty budget, and I just spectacularly failed in January. Yeah, so I had the proof that that was not an effective strategy for me. That is why I chose to do no buys and then like no rules kind of. So this time I feel like I'm a little bit more prepared, and partly that's because I'm more used to like being mindful about these things, and part of it is because, like, if I'm honest, having a larger, more high quality makeup collection, I do feel like that helps, you know, to resist the urge to buy new things. But I also recognize that the desire to buy things is not always rational, and it's not always based on what you have or what you need. I always have trouble like sitting up straight when I'm filming. I feel like I tend to like migrate down. So going forward, my plan is to do what I'm calling in my head an optional no buy. This is really just a low buy. Most people would just call that a low buy. But for me, I think it is easier to think of it as a no buy. As I've been talking about in the past, when I've been on a low buy, I find myself agonizing about how to spend my budget or how to spend my limited transactions. Do I want this palette or do I want that palette? Is this a good use of my money? It becomes a fixation, but that sort of assumes that the default condition of a low buy is asking yourself what to buy, which is ultimately just basically looking for something to want. And that is like obviously antithetical to the whole point of a low buy. And that seems like so dumb and so obvious to me now. But before, I really think that being on a low buy, I was coming from a place of like an automatic yes, and then I was having to talk myself each time. I was having to talk myself into a no. And of course, that was setting myself up for failure. That was making things a lot more difficult than they needed to be. It's like sort of just crystallized to me now that a low buy should still have an automatic no. Is that obvious to everyone else? For some reason, it wasn't obvious to me. Then you can sort of like passively wait for something to be so good that it breaks through the automatic no. Thinking about like consuming wisely and consuming moderately, it was putting my focus on the wrong things. Whereas now I do feel more prepared to succeed at a low buy. But I want to make sure that I don't forget the automatic no. So that's why for now, I'm sort of thinking of this for myself as a no buy where I can sometimes choose to buy things, if that makes sense. And ideally, the things that like break through the automatic no, like that should happen pretty sparingly. So it might be something that's been on my wish list for a really long time, or, you know, a replacement product that I need, or maybe it's a way to like take advantage of a sale or buy something that's limited edition, or even occasionally allowing a purchase just to take off pressure if I'm feeling like it's difficult. These should still be sparing, moderate purchases. And I still want to look at new releases from the point of view of like, I'm on a no buy, I have an automatic no. And I have like no end date for this. I've often like played these things by ear. Theoretically, this would be the way that I would like to approach things like forever. But I'm open to the idea that things could change, and maybe this gets out of control again and I start buying too much and then I go back on a no buy, and like that could definitely happen. One of the things that has recently been really influencing my thinking around this is this book I'm listening to right now, an audiobook called Less is More. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, but this is still like the makeup portion of the video. So don't disappear yet if you're still interested in like the makeup and consumption stuff. It is related to this book because I've been so influenced by this in the last few days, and it's what really like helped me put my thoughts together for this video, which I've been meaning to do for a while. Let me find what's the full title of this. Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World by Jason Hickel. If you have Spotify Premium, this is one of the audiobooks that's included, so that's how I'm listening to it. From the title, Less is More, I think it sounds a little bit like a self-help book, but it's more like a political manifesto. This book has been so incredibly helpful for me in learning more and like clarifying my thinking about like how capitalism functions, its basic role as a means of control. And I'm still listening to this. I haven't gotten to the end yet, but like I already feel like I've already recommended it to other people. I already feel like I can recommend it to you. But like the basic premise of this book is like how capitalism relies on growth. So, you know, not just making a profit, but growing the profit every year and growing the GDP every year, which GDP, we already know it doesn't take into account a lot of things that are important, and it rewards a lot of things that are bad for society. And yet growth and like the growth of the economy becomes a stand-in for progress, and it becomes a stand-in for like how well people are doing and how well a country is doing, even though it doesn't capture that. Perpetual exponential growth is just not sustainable. It's just not feasible. And so his basic premise is that we need to let go of that idea. We need to stop mandating growth and stop measuring everything in terms of growth. Like there's no way to solve the climate crisis if we're prioritizing growth, and no way to like build an equitable society if we're prioritizing growth. And also growth doesn't mean economic prosperity for people. Like it just doesn't measure that. I feel like I left out a few important parts of his argument. He makes a very concrete case that exponential economic growth is simply incompatible with addressing climate change. For one thing, if the economy is growing every year and you're trying to decarbonize the economy, which is already extremely difficult and may or may not happen, when your economy and your resource use is continuing to grow every year, then every year you're having to decarbonize a larger economy, and you're going to cancel out any gains that you made in sustainability. And similarly, under the premise of constant growth, efficiency gains are always just reinvested back into producing more or extracting more. So, like, if a technology comes along that makes manufacturing more energy efficient, we're not going to end up using less energy overall to make stuff. We're just going to end up manufacturing more stuff. That is what capitalism mandates because of the requirement of constant growth. And when you look at green technologies like EVs and solar panels, they still have an environmental footprint that is very large and that needs to be dealt with. So the solution is not to replace every single car with an EV and then continue to add new cars. The solution is to replace every car with an EV and then have fewer cars every year. Under a system of continuous growth, we will never reduce our resource use, and we will never reduce our environmental impact. So that's an important point he makes, because the book is not just about capitalism, but it's about specifically how capitalism requires constant growth and how that inevitably destroys the environment. Like, they are incompatible. There is no way around it. We need to stop growing the economy. And relatedly, we need to reduce our consumption. It's really, really valuable. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I really recommend this book. But one of the things he's been talking about a lot in the passages I've been listening to in the last few days is the idea of like a material footprint or material budget, and the idea that all aspects of consumption degrade the environment, not just plastic waste. And people in the global north, including myself, have vastly overspent their material budget for resources, for consumption, for products, for physical material. We've overspent the piece of that we should be allotted if we're gonna stay within the bounds of what the planet can sustain. Meanwhile, in the global south, people have not even spent their material budget, even though as a planet we need to vastly reduce the amount that we consume. So the footprint and the consumption and the impact, that's not distributed equitably. I can tell myself I'm gonna recycle the material, I can tell myself I'm gonna pan things and not waste them, but one of the most important things I can do is to consume fewer things. He also talks sort of about how exploitation is really intrinsic to capitalism, and I thought it was so interesting to hear his summary of the history of how capitalism arose during in the Middle Ages in Europe during a period known as enclosure, which I'd heard of before, but the way he tells the story is really useful, I found. But basically, one of the ways that capitalism works is by privatizing resources, cutting off people's access to resources, and then making it so that people are forced to sell their labor in order to just meet their basic needs for survival. And in this way, they can be controlled as laborers. So this began in Europe during the period of enclosure, but it was replicated then in the colonies on a much, much larger scale. And as an example that he cites, which it's an audiobook, so it's hard for me to go back and reference the details. So I'm not giving the specific details because I don't remember them, so apologies for that. But one of the examples that he gives is where the colonial powers were burning orchards that people had depended on for food, so that the local people in the colonies would have no choice but to labor for a wage, which, is probably an unfair wage. And then they would also become dependent on the colonial powers to sell them back food as consumers. So in this way, capitalists exert control over people both as laborers and as consumers. And of course, this is not even taking into account forced labor, which obviously played a huge role in fueling capitalism and consolidating wealth. But I think it does go to show that even through like free labor, capitalism functions as a system of control. So while capitalism does exploit everyone to some extent except for the ruling class, is how I would say it, it's obvious that it exploits some people much, 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 much more than others. And even though I am extremely privileged in the grand scheme of things, I still feel like as a consumer, I am often being manipulated and controlled in order to like enable somebody else's exploitation further up the supply chain. And I'm not saying that we as individuals are responsible for all the bad things that happen in the world. I'm just kind of thinking about how I can resist the ways that capitalism wants to use me and how I can resist some of the messages that I'm getting from like ads and content, even though I try to be mindful and I tell myself that like I have free will and like I know that advertising is trying to get me to buy things. Even so, like things slip in, and I think that ultimately everyone is probably more susceptible to that than they realize. So yeah, all of that is to say that I really recommend this book, Less is More, and also, the environmental factors, the social factors, they've always been motivations for me to try and like reduce my footprint, but they've just been more front of mind since I've been reading this book, which I appreciate. So with that, I am going to transition now into giving you a little update on my like reading goals, which I freely admit my reading goals are low. Like some people are reading like 50 books, 100 books in a year. Like I see my friends on Goodreads and like I'm impressed. I'm so impressed, but those aren't the kind of goals that I am dealing with. I set for myself the goal of reading one book every 2 months in the year of 2024. And that goal applies specifically to physical books that I like read. Because I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and audiobooks are great. I fully support listening to audiobooks. I'm not gonna stop listening to audiobooks, but I have a very different experience with audiobooks. I got diagnosed with ADHD about a year ago and have felt that my focus has been like really, really deteriorating in the last few years, and I wasn't getting the joy from reading that I used to get like many years ago, especially as a kid. Yeah, so listening to audiobooks is a totally different experience for me. It allows me to sort of like come in and out. I appreciate that audiobooks just like keep going even when I space out, so I can go back if I feel I need to, but I don't like stop making progress in the book, if that makes sense. Whereas when I'm reading a physical book, I'm really, really tempted to like put it down, to get distracted, and then like never come back to it. And it's more difficult for me, but it's so valuable at the same time. It's not a skill I want to lose, and so that's why I'm really focusing on that as my goal, and why my goal is pretty low. I recognize that. So to briefly shout out a few audiobooks that I have really enjoyed this year, in addition to Less is More, I also listened to The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. That is similarly, it's a book about capitalism, sort of the ways that capitalism works to control things and explain the state of our world. And I found that so useful in just like crystallizing the way that I look at things, like everything. And she focuses in that book a lot about the Iraq War. Her basic premise is that like capitalists, like powerful forces, whether they're like people or corporations, they'll take advantage of like moments of disaster and emergency to take control and to impose free market capitalism and consolidate wealth. So the big example that she uses is the Iraq War, but she goes through other examples as well. One of them is Hurricane Katrina. This book came out a few years ago, but like Naomi Klein has also written about climate change, and I think it's really, really important to be thinking about climate change in these terms, because like we have to be wary of people coming in and taking advantage of all these disasters that are happening right now all over the place at all times, that they are moments of opportunity for certain people. So that's another one that I highly recommend. And I'm talking about that one in a little bit more detail because it is relevant to the things that I talk about on my channel, and maybe things that you're interested in too if you're here and you're still watching the video. I also listened to The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. And that is by Rashid Khalidi. And it is also on Spotify for free if you have a premium subscription. So I also highly recommend that. It's really good for getting historical context on the situation in Palestine right now. I've talked about this on my channel as well, and like everything, I can find a way to link it back to makeup. So I do have a video on BDS and why I'm boycotting in support of Palestine. So I will also link that down below. But this is one of the sources that really helped me gain historical context and learn a little bit more about how to talk about this conflict and the genocide that's happening right now in Gaza. And I think if you're interested in that, and if you are watching the genocide unfold and you're like horrified and you want to find a way to talk about it with people and like bring more awareness and attention to it in your daily life, I think this is a really good resource for you. One of the ways that people will discredit people who speak out in support of Palestine is to say that they don't understand the context, that this context is like so unique on the face of the planet, and that nobody could ever understand it enough to have an opinion. And I completely disagree with that, and I don't think that you have to have a history degree to look at what's happening and be like, that's wrong, you know, that's really bad. People can and should have opinions on what's happening. But if you want to understand it more deeply, and if you want to talk about it in a more productive way, by all means, like, look into the history. And personally, I found this book to be a really useful, like, background. Now for physical books, I have been meeting my goal. Well, I'm on track to meet my goal. I need to finish another one by the end of this month. So the first one I read this year was Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. I actually know Gerardo, and he is a fantastic writer. Gerardo tends to write like kind of magical fantastical writing about charming monsters is how I would describe it. This book is about, there's this couple, they have a child who dies from a lung disease, and the mother, in her sort of distress, secretly cuts away a piece of the child's lung after he's died. She like keeps it in a jar, and like over the next few months the lung grows and gains sentience and grows into this little creature called Monstrilio. Gerardo's writing, I would say, it strikes this really interesting balance between like gruesome and charming and lyrical, and this is another one that I highly recommend. He also is an illustrator, and the book includes a little illustration of Monstrilio, which I think really sums up the whole vibe. There it is. I think that just really captures Monstrilio. It captures this book, and it captures like what Gerardo is doing in his fiction. In March and April, I read this book called Ways of Going Home by Alejandro Zambra. I had read another book of his called Bonsai, which I really liked, And I know that he tends to write very short, very lyrical novels, and they kind of like experiment with form in like this sort of like postmodern way where there's like a story within a story or a book within a book. So those are always fun. I do like those, and this had been on my to be read list for a long time, and it was short. So that's one of the reasons that I chose it for this particular goal, because I was like running behind. But it's about like a man who's writing a book, and he's sort of reflecting on his childhood during the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And that was interesting actually to read, because I was listening to the Naomi Klein book at the same time, and she talks a lot about the Pinochet dictatorship, which I had like zero historical context on. So that actually helped me understand the Zambra book better. I think part of what he was doing was sort of reckoning with his experience living through an important historical moment as a child where he didn't really participate and he didn't really understand what was happening. And now, like years later, he's also trying to reconcile like his father's political leanings and also political apathy during a time when so many people were like risking their lives for their political beliefs. Final book, this is the one I'm reading right now. This is called Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. She is a British Palestinian writer, and this book is set in Palestine. It's about a woman who is British Palestinian coming back to Palestine after having spent summers there as a kid. She gets involved with this production of Hamlet that one of her friends is putting on in the West Bank. And I've really been enjoying this. It's beautifully written, and I find this so immersive so far. I found it difficult to recapture that feeling of like being really immersed in a book and like wanting to get back into it and like not wanting to surface from it. This book is helping me recapture some of that. I do feel like her writing is very rich and like slow in a way that it's not boring. It's just like each scene feels very lived in. We get a lot of interiority from the character, a lot of like facial expressions and little gestures and body language. You just feel like really immersed, which I really appreciate and really admire. I think that's a sign of excellent writing. So I had an outline for that whole video except for the book part, and then I was like, okay, talk about books here, and then like I proceeded to ramble for like probably 30 minutes in real time. So hopefully this video is like not too overwhelming. Thank you so much. If you stayed this whole time, thank you. Even if you dipped out after the makeup portion and you're no longer here, like thank you from afar. I really appreciate having a place to like put out these thoughts about makeup, but also how they intersect with other things, because those two things are like so much of just like how I've been like thinking and feeling lately. Thank you so much. I hope that you come back for the next video, and I will see you then. Bye.